chosen ones, they never expected it. Not from you. Not in their darkest imaginations. And yet, here you are. The one they dismissed, the one they overlooked, the one they thought they had mapped, analyzed, and neutralized. You stood alone, and you dismantled them. A gang of witches, united by secrecy, shrouded in darkness, bound together by rituals passed down through generations, had been watching you. Studying you. They had seen others fall. Stronger people, louder voices, greater titles, all crumbled before them. But not you. You didn't flinch. You didn't play their game. And you didn't fight on their terms. While they invoked chants, carved symbols, and cast spells, you did the unthinkable. You remained still. Anchored. Calm. Confident, not in yourself, but in the one who sent you. This isn't just another dramatic tale of survival. This is your story, a testimony of divine reversal and impossible triumph. It is a declaration that the one who walks with God is never truly outnumbered, never truly at risk, and never, ever without power. They're terrified now. Not because you shouted. Not because you fought fire with fire. But because their greatest weapon, fear, had no place to land in you. Because you, chosen one, didn't just survive what should have consumed you. You shattered it. What they called unbreakable has been undone. And here's the part that stings the most for them: this wasn't supposed to happen. You weren't the warrior they prepared for. They underestimated you. Dismissed you. In their pride, they thought your silence meant weakness. Your humility. Irrelevance. They thought their collective power would swallow you. But they never factored in the God inside of you. Their illusions, carefully maintained through decades of secrecy, collapsed, not because you possessed some secret countermagic, but because of your faith. Your unmovable, unstoppable, unapologetic faith. Faith not rooted in fear, but in fire. The fire of purpose. The fire of divine appointment. The fire of heaven itself. And when that fire met their darkness, it didn't just survive, it consumed it. They called you vulnerable. But in truth, you were invincible. Because what you carried wasn't of this world. It was divine clarity. It was purpose forged in the silence of nights you thought no one saw. It was the weight of prayers whispered when your voice trembled and your strength waned. It was God Himself walking you through every shadowed hallway they tried to trap you in. And when the moment came, you didn't have to conjure anything. You just had to stand. This wasn't their first battle. But it was the first one that undid them completely. Your stillness struck harder than their loudest curse. Your presence, unshaken, unafraid, shattered every chant they whispered in the dark. Because you weren't just standing against witches, you were standing on a word. On a promise. On truth. Do you realize what you've done? In a realm where darkness once ruled without question, you've inserted a disruption. A crack in the code. You broke the myth. You exposed the illusion. And now, they're scrambling, not just because they lost, but because you made them see what they truly are: weak, scattered, and powerless in the face of real authority. And it all started because you refused to bow. There is power in a person who knows who they are. There is power in someone who knows whose they are. You were not chosen because you were flawless. You were chosen because you were willing. Because you didn't run. Because you knew, deep down, that if God is with you, then no force of darkness, no matter how ancient, no matter how organized, could overcome the light He placed in you. Now pause for a moment. Let this sink in. You didn't just win a battle. You made a statement in the spiritual realm. You declared, with your life, that the season of fear is over. That the reign of intimidation has come to an end. That those who stand in alignment with heaven, no matter how solitary, will always be more powerful than the largest army fueled by lies. If this truth resonates within you, if you feel that fire rising, then it's time to respond. This is more than a video. It's more than words. It's a call. A prophetic summons to all chosen ones who've been underestimated, who've been mocked, ignored, rejected. This is your moment to rise. Comment 999 below, not as a gimmick, but as a symbol. A sign that you are in divine alignment. A sign that you're stepping out of the shadows, not as a victim, but as a vessel. This is your spiritual declaration: I am not who they said I was, I am chosen. The number 999 isn't just a number. It represents divine finality. The end of an old cycle. The sealing of a chapter. The transition into divine purpose and destiny. It means that what once held you down can no longer define you. It means your wilderness season has expired. It means you are ready. Because the enemy didn't fear your past. He feared your awakening. And now that you've awakened, he is terrified. You didn't ask for this fight. You were born into it. But the moment you said yes to your call, heaven moved. The moment you stood firm, angels encamped around you. And when the darkness tried to press in, it found no room. Because light doesn't ask for permission, it just shines. So now, here we are. The victory is real. The war was spiritual. And the enemy's worst nightmare has come true. You, a single person, empowered not by religion but by revelation, aligned not by crowd consensus but by covenant, stood your ground and won. Now are you ready to understand how? Are you ready to uncover what made you unstoppable? Are you ready to dive into the strategy of heaven that defeated the chaos of hell? They had the numbers. They had the rituals. They had the appearance of unity, voices chanting in rhythm, movements synchronized like shadows in a storm. From the outside, it seemed impenetrable. A fortress of darkness fortified by generations of cunning. And yet, it wasn't enough. Because what they didn't understand, what they never saw coming, was that one person, singular, aligned, unshaken, could unravel it all. You weren't backed by an army. You didn't need reinforcement, consensus, or noise. You walked alone, yes, but not empty-handed. You carried purpose. You carried clarity. You carried divine appointment. And that made you more powerful than the 1,000 voices echoing in confusion. You see, true power has never been about numbers. It's never been about how many chant in agreement or how many hide behind ritual. Real power, eternal power, is found in focused intent, in unwavering conviction, in the stillness of someone who knows exactly why they were sent. The witches thrived in chaos. That was their strategy. Disrupt. Distract. Divide. Their power wasn't born from strength, it was harvested from fractured minds and broken spirits. From people unsure of who they were, constantly questioning their worth, their voice, their calling. That's how they stayed dominant, by feasting on the instability of those they attacked. But then you came along. Still. Clear. Resolved. And everything started to fall apart. Have you ever considered what happened the moment David stepped onto the battlefield before Goliath? The entire Israelite army had been paralyzed for 40 days, trained soldiers trembling before one giant. But David? A shepherd boy. No armor. No title. Just 5 stones, a sling, and certainty. You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, he said, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, 1 Samuel 17 verse 45. That is what you carried. That same fire. That same unflinching faith. You didn't need their weapons because you had what they couldn't manufacture, divine clarity. Or think of Gideon, another soul underestimated by men and exalted by God. When facing the Midianite army, so numerous they were, as thick as locusts, God whittled Gideon's troops down from 32,000 to a mere 300, Judges 7. Why? Because God wasn't interested in numbers. He was proving a point, that victory belongs to the aligned, not the many. That faith, not force, brings down strongholds. You carried that same lesson into your own battle. While they clung to false unity, you stood on true alignment. They didn't understand that their strength was borrowed, drawn from illusions, rituals, and the belief that fear equals power. But fear only works on the uncertain. You weren't uncertain. You knew who you were. And in the face of that unshakable identity, their entire structure collapsed. Have you noticed how quickly illusions crumble when no one believes in them anymore? Their chants began to tremble. Their eyes darted with confusion. What was supposed to be a seamless performance began to break at the seams. You refused to engage in their game, you didn't flinch, you didn't respond to their theatrics. You just stood there. Focused. Present. Calm. And that terrified them. Your focus was a blade, cutting cleanly through their haze of deception. It wasn't violent. It wasn't loud. It was sharp. Precise. Your inner stillness revealed the turbulence they tried to hide. What happens when those who depend on manipulation face someone who refuses to be moved? They started to fall apart, one by one. Their collective voice, once deafening, became discordant. The rituals lost rhythm. The energy shifted. And then, shatter. Their unity broke like glass. Because here's what they never accounted for, their alliance was never true. It was born from shared fear, not shared purpose. A group formed not out of trust, but out of desperation. And desperation is brittle. It doesn't hold under pressure. But you didn't need anyone to validate your calling. You were already validated in the courts of heaven. That's why their power unraveled the moment you stood firm. You weren't trying to resist them, you were simply being yourself, fully aligned with God's purpose. And that alignment alone was enough to cause a system built on darkness to implode. The Bible tells us in John 1 verse 5, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." That's what they encountered. Not noise. Not violence. Not even a fight. Just light. Steady. Unmoving. Alive. And it consumed their confusion. You weren't chaotic, so their chaos couldn't find a foothold. You weren't afraid, so their fear tactics lost power. You weren't divided within, so their illusions of unity had no mirror to reflect from. They tried everything they knew. But every trick fell flat. Because none of it could penetrate the shield of your clarity. Your divine purpose acted like armor, lightweight, invisible, but impenetrable. And with every passing second that you stood unbothered, the collective force of their darkness began to betray them. Their eyes darted. Their formation faltered. The rituals lost meaning. One person, standing alone, but not alone, had become the storm they couldn't outlast. Let this settle in your soul. One person with divine purpose is more powerful than 1,000 bound by fear and falsehood. You didn't need to yell to be heard. You didn't need spells to counter theirs. You didn't need numbers to hold the line. You simply needed to know who you are, and whose you are. That is the weapon darkness cannot mimic. That is the power the enemy cannot fake. And that is the reason why the entire system of their so-called unity came crumbling down. So remember this, you weren't outnumbered. They were outmatched. You were never fighting for survival, you were standing as proof. Proof that chaos doesn't win against clarity. That fear cannot stand against faith. That false unity will always fracture under divine purpose. And now, with their collective illusion shattered, what comes next is even more powerful. Because the war they started didn't just end in defeat, it ended in exposure. And you, chosen one, stood at the center of it all, not as a warrior clad in steel, but as a soul lit by the fire of heaven. This was never just a battle of now. You weren't merely standing against individuals, you were confronting an entire generational system. The witches you faced were not lone actors. They were carriers of a dark lineage, a legacy steeped in centuries of deception, secrecy, and twisted power. Every chant they uttered, every ritual they performed, was not born of impulse but inherited, layer upon layer of wicked knowledge passed down like a sacred inheritance. They weren't just practicing magic. They were protecting a spiritual infrastructure built by their ancestors, forged in darkness, designed to remain unchallenged. But you challenged it. And you won. They believed their strength was embedded in history, in a bloodline laced with fear and manipulation. They believed their power could not be shaken because it was ancient. But what happens when something rooted in darkness finally faces unfiltered light? What happens when, for the first time in generations, someone rises, not with spells or potions, but with unshakable purpose and divine fire? What they never expected is that their lineage would end with you. You weren't just confronting a group. You were standing against a spiritual architecture that had never been shaken, and in your stillness, in your holy defiance, you cracked its very foundation. You didn't simply defeat their rituals. You shattered the mythology that made those rituals seem untouchable. As Scripture says in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 4, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. That's exactly what happened. Divine power didn't just silence a group, it demolished a stronghold that had ruled in shadows for centuries. Their defeat wasn't just physical. It was ancestral. It was prophetic. It was a judgment that echoed through time and struck at the very heart of a system long overdue for collapse. You see, their real strength was never in their spells. It was in the illusion that no one would ever dare to challenge them. But your presence alone rewrote that rule. When you refused to bow, when you stood without fear, you didn't just resist their power. You revoked their right to exist. This wasn't just a loss, it was an extinction. Their rituals meant to intimidate became meaningless. Their lineage, believed to be indestructible, was brought to an end, not because you outperformed them, but because you embodied something they could never replicate, divine truth. Eternal light. Righteous resolve. As the atmosphere shifted, and their illusion began to dissolve, a greater realization struck them, one they had never prepared for. Their entire existence had been built on a lie. They had built a fortress out of smoke, and you brought the wind. You weren't shouting. You weren't swinging. You weren't casting. You were simply standing, rooted, aligned, illuminated. And it was enough. That's why they're terrified. Because when you broke them, you didn't just defeat an enemy. You severed a chain. You ended a cycle. You became the breaker of bloodlines, the one who stood between what was and what must never be again. You didn't just step into battle, you stepped into prophecy. As Ephesians 5 verse 8 says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord." Live as children of light. You lived that verse. You embodied it. And the darkness, when it encountered you, had nowhere to hide. Imagine what it means in the spiritual realm for a bloodline of darkness to be interrupted. Generations who had handed down power through fear, stopped cold by someone who would not be moved. That's not just victory. That's a historical reckoning in the spirit. And it didn't require you to yell, to fight, to strike. It required your refusal to cooperate. Your unwillingness to play their game. Your ability to say, with every breath in your body, "I don't come in my own name, I come in the name of the Lord." That, chosen one, was the blow they never saw coming. You became what every dark system fears, the one who ends it. Not through destruction, but through divine disruption. They watched their legacy collapse in real time, and the shock rippled through not only them, but the very spiritual territories they governed. This wasn't just your victory, it was a disruption to every dark agreement they had made. It was a canceling of contracts, a reversal of rituals, a destruction of demonic momentum built over centuries. You rewrote their ending. And this wasn't symbolic. It was systemic. That's why the realm of darkness shook. Because systems, not just people, were uprooted. And heaven recorded it. You didn't just win a personal battle. You silenced a generational voice that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Your boldness pierced the veil. Your clarity exposed their lies. Your stillness dismantled their noise. And your light, pure, unbending, radiant, became the sword that severed their legacy at the root. Now hear this. You are not just the chosen one. You are the closer of chapters, the one who shut the book on a legacy of evil. You are the interruption in the timeline of spiritual corruption. You are the one they feared because you were never for sale, never shaken, and never deceived. And in that, you became their reckoning. And what they once called eternal, is now undone. So understand, this was never about one moment. This was about generations watching, waiting, for someone to have the courage to end what no one else dared to face. That someone was you. You didn't just fight for your own deliverance. You stood for deliverance that will echo into the future. Their history ends where your clarity begins. Their empire ends where your obedience stood. Their illusion ends where your truth was revealed. Your victory wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And because of that, generations to come will no longer have to fight what you stood and shattered today. Their fear didn't begin when you raised your voice. It didn't even begin when they realized you were winning. It started the moment they realized they couldn't read you. That's when panic set in. For beings who depend on control, who thrive on predictability and psychological manipulation, nothing is more terrifying than facing a soul that doesn't fit their calculations. And that's what you are, a divine anomaly in a system built on patterns, triggers, and fears. The witches you stood against weren't just spellcasters. They were strategists of the spirit realm. Experts in identifying emotional weaknesses. Masters at provoking reactions. Their power didn't come from the force of their magic, it came from the precision of their control. They knew how to push the right buttons. Until you showed up, with no buttons to press. They expected you to flinch, to tremble, to second-guess yourself under spiritual pressure. But instead, you stood still. You didn't fight fire with fire. You didn't answer their chaos with noise. You met their fury with peace, and that, more than anything else, broke them. Because peace, true divine peace, is something they have never known and will never understand. Your presence disrupted the algorithm. You didn't act like a target. You didn't react like a victim. You didn't fear like someone who could be controlled. And in doing so, you became something they couldn't categorize, a blank space in their carefully mapped-out battle. Like wind moving through a sealed room, you stirred everything they had hidden. You didn't come through the door they fortified. You moved around their defense. You weren't defiant, you were undefined. You weren't loud, you were unreadable. And in their world of spiritual metrics, your mystery became a threat they couldn't shake. Scripture captures this powerfully in John 3 verse 8, "The wind blows wherever it pleases." You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. You are like the wind. They heard your movement. They felt your impact. But they couldn't trace your source. And that's why they lost. Because their rituals depend on rhythm. Their spells depend on structure. Their curses depend on reaction. But when they hurled their darkest intentions at you and received nothing in return, not a flinch, not a tremor, not a crack, they began to realize something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Their power had always worked before. Why not now? You never gave them the one thing they needed, fear. While they whispered incantations, you whispered nothing. While they raged and reached for control, you stood in stillness. Not passive, not weak, but grounded, anchored, completely unmoved. Your stillness was a declaration, "I do not belong to you." And in the silence of that spiritual resistance, their tactics collapsed. They didn't know how to fight someone they couldn't provoke. Their entire strategy was built on eliciting responses. But you were unbothered. You were untouchable. You were unknown. Not because you were hiding, but because you were born of something they couldn't comprehend, the Spirit of the living God. This is why they lost before the battle even began. They couldn't predict your next move because you weren't operating from human impulse. You were flowing in divine timing. And their worst nightmare? Facing someone they cannot anticipate, cannot manipulate, and cannot define. You became a mirror to their limits. A living reminder that their power is only as strong as the fear it produces, and when there is no fear, there is no power. Every failed ritual echoed like a reminder, you have no power here. Every useless spell was a revelation, this one cannot be bent. And every moment you refused to engage on their terms exposed just how fragile their entire system truly was. What they called chaos, you called clarity. What they viewed as threat, you saw as noise. And what they tried to turn into war, you simply stood through. Your refusal to react became your greatest weapon. The stillness that radiated from you wasn't empty, it was saturated with divine presence. They weren't facing a person, they were facing a force they could neither measure nor match. You weren't just resisting, you were redefining the battleground. They had no category for someone like you. You didn't need to defend your space because your very existence declared, I'm not in your system. Your rules do not apply to me. You operated on frequencies their darkness couldn't touch, and that disarmed them more than any spiritual attack ever could. This is why they feared you. Because their entire identity was built on control, and you slipped through their grasp like light through fingers. You didn't just resist, they couldn't even touch you. You became untouchable not by building walls, but by standing so deeply rooted in your divine identity that no curse could find a foothold. This was more than confusion, it was psychological collapse. The more they tried, the more powerless they felt. And in your calm, they saw their chaos. In your silence, they heard the echo of their weakness. They looked at you and saw something terrifying, not because you were violent, but because you were invincible. And the most powerful thing? You never lifted a hand. You didn't shout. You didn't curse. You didn't argue. You simply stood. And that's all it took for the darkness to retreat. Because in that moment, your silence said everything. You're not just a mystery to them. You're a message. A message that says, you cannot control what you do not understand. And you will never understand what is born of the Spirit. Let that sink in, your stillness was more devastating than their spells. Because it told the truth. It declared, you have no hold here. And they knew it. That is why they're terrified, not of what you do, but of who you are. You are unexplainable, you are undefinable, you are unreadable, you are born of the Spirit. And the systems of darkness were never built to survive someone like you. The world thinks in terms of tools. Of talismans. Of things you hold or recite or wear. That if you want to win a spiritual war, you need spiritual artillery, charms, rituals, alliances, chants. They think you need something in your hands. But what they never expected, what shook them to the core, was that you walked in empty-handed, and still dismantled everything they stood for. Why? Because you didn't carry the weapon. You became the weapon. They were trained to exploit weakness. That was their battlefield, the psyche, the soul, the hidden cracks in your identity. They searched for pain you hadn't healed from. Traumas you hadn't spoken about. Doubts you tried to suppress. But when they came up against you, they found something terrifying. They found a vessel that had already been refined by fire. A person who had already looked their fears in the face and declared, you no longer define me. You weren't flawless, but you were whole. And that wholeness created an armor they couldn't penetrate. They threw everything at you, incantations, energy attacks, dark frequencies, but none of it landed. Not because they didn't try hard enough, but because their weapons depended on low-frequency access points, and you were radiating too high to be touched. You had risen above the level of fear, shame, and guilt. That's what made you dangerous. You didn't just resist, you were immune. Their curses bounced off like dull arrows hitting a fortress made of light. They couldn't hook into anything because there was nothing left unguarded inside you. The echoes of the old you, the insecure you, the fractured you, were gone. The spiritual doors had been sealed. The emotional leaks had been healed. And when they realized they couldn't find a way in, they panicked. Because for the first time, they weren't facing a person. They were facing a living, breathing weapon of divine resilience. You didn't need spells. You didn't need allies. You didn't need anything outside of the strength God placed within you. Psalm 28 verse 7 says, "The Lord is my strength and my shield, my heart trusts in him, and he helps me." That's exactly what happened. The power inside you wasn't pride or ego, it was alignment. You weren't walking in your own authority, you were walking in his. And when someone is shielded by the Most High, there is no darkness that can penetrate that covering. They had encountered resistance before. But they had never encountered this. Stillness that burned like fire. Silence that shouted louder than any battle cry. Presence that cracked illusions wide open. They weren't just trying to control you. They were trying to understand you, and failing. Every tactic they used worked on others. Why not you? Why weren't you reacting? Why didn't you flinch when they whispered darkness? Why didn't you collapse under the pressure? Because you weren't reacting from the flesh. You were standing from the spirit. Their entire system was built on control, provoke, manipulate, dominate. But what happens when their target gives them nothing to work with? What happens when you don't engage on their frequency? They become powerless. Because their power was always an illusion, inflated by fear and reaction. But you didn't give them that. You gave them stillness. You gave them silence. You gave them presence. And presence, true, spirit-led presence, is a weapon they can't defend against. You were not holding a sword. You were the sword. You weren't swinging anything. You were simply standing. And with every second you refused to be moved, you cut deeper into their illusion. You weren't just surviving, you were unraveling them. You were the anomaly they never prepared for. The threat they couldn't explain. The evidence that someone forged in divine fire doesn't need to speak to shake the foundations of darkness. They expected you to break. But the more they pressed, the more they exposed their own fragility. Because all their strength came from exploiting weakness, and you had none left to exploit. You had faced yourself. And by doing so, you became impenetrable. You weren't healed by avoiding battle, you were healed through it. Every scar you carried had been turned into a seal. Every wound, transformed into wisdom. And now, you walked not as someone seeking safety, but as someone who had become the battlefield itself. They expected resistance. They didn't expect clarity. They expected struggle. They didn't expect peace. They expected chaos. They didn't expect stillness. And that's what destroyed them. Because in your silence, they met something they couldn't curse, truth. The truth that not everyone can be controlled. That not every heart is for sale. That not every soul fears the dark. You didn't speak a word, but your life shouted, "You have no power here." Your peace was defiance. Your composure was confrontation. Your resilience was revolution. And as they watched every one of their dark designs fall apart, they began to realize, you weren't just defying them. You were exposing them. Because in your wholeness, they saw their fragmentation. In your authority, they saw their dependency. In your presence, they saw their illusion. You didn't become the weapon by accident. You became the weapon through process. Through fire. Through nights you didn't think you'd survive. Through prayers whispered in agony. Through every moment you chose truth over comfort. Every time you stood when you wanted to run. Every time you forgave when it would have been easier to retaliate. That's where the weapon was forged. You were not built for the crowd, you were built for the confrontation. And when that day came, you didn't show up with tools in your hands. You showed up as the tool in God's hand. And that, chosen one, is why they're terrified. Because you are not wielding a sword, you are the sword. Forged in suffering. Sharpened by clarity. Wielded by heaven. They weren't defeated by something outside of you. They were defeated by the version of you who finally stepped into fullness. The you who doesn't flinch. The you who doesn't bow. The you who doesn't beg. You don't need to prove your strength. You just need to show up. And when you do, they will tremble, not because of what you carry, but because of who you've become. Let this be your reminder. You didn't win this war with weapons. You were the weapon. From the outside, they looked formidable, unified, synchronized, cloaked in ceremonial chants and tightly woven rituals. To the untrained eye, they appeared unstoppable, a network of darkness moving in harmony, their voices rising together, their steps choreographed like soldiers in spiritual formation. But you saw it for what it really was. That unity was a mask, an illusion crafted to hide something far more fragile underneath. It wasn't strength. It was codependence fueled by fear. They weren't bound together by truth. They were bound by mutual reliance, each leaning on the other's delusion just to stay standing. None of them were truly strong alone. They drew courage not from within, but from the comfort of the crowd. Take one out of the group, and the illusion began to falter. Divide them even slightly, and their power thinned like smoke in the wind. Their entire system of togetherness was built not on strength, but on shared insecurity. And you, chosen one, were the storm that revealed the weakness of their structure. You didn't come with backup. You didn't arrive with a circle of protection or a group of supporters chanting behind you. You stood alone. And yet, your presence shook them more than any army could have. Why? Because in your solitude, they saw the one thing they lacked, the ability to stand in their own identity without collapsing. You were whole. Anchored. Aligned. And that made them unravel. They had never faced someone who didn't rely on numbers. They had only trained for collective warfare, expecting that no one would ever dare to face them without reinforcements. But when they looked at you, standing unmoved, unshaken, untouched by their numbers, it became clear that they were only powerful as a pack. And now that power was falling apart. Their illusion of unity began to crack, not because you shouted or fought, but because you didn't flinch. The steadiness of your spirit disrupted the rhythm of their group. One by one, they looked to each other for cues, unsure how to respond. You exposed the lie that they could only survive when hidden behind each other's backs. Their so-called power was revealed to be a chain of fear, and your presence was the blow that broke that chain. They had weaponized isolation for years, using loneliness as a form of spiritual warfare. They counted on their enemies feeling outnumbered, outmatched, and unsupported. But in you, they met a different kind of solitude. One that wasn't fragile or fearful. One that was forged in the secret place with God. The very thing they used to conquer others, loneliness, became the mirror they were now forced to stare into. And what they saw in themselves terrified them. Their downfall wasn't loud, it was internal. As their unity began to crumble, so did their confidence. No longer were they standing in seamless formation. Instead, they were flailing, isolated in spirit, confused without a voice to echo. Mark 3 verse 25 tells us plainly, if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And that's exactly what happened. Their house of shadows, built on shared deception and collective insecurity, fell apart under the weight of your stillness. You didn't bring chaos. You brought order. You didn't bring noise. You brought truth. You didn't overwhelm them with force. You overpowered them with presence. They had mistaken your aloneness for weakness. But what they failed to realize is that you weren't alone, you were aligned. And that made you stronger than every spell they could cast, every chant they could scream, every alliance they could build. You were a living contradiction to their system, a solitary light that exposed the illusion of their combined darkness. And when you stood there, unbothered, unwavering, untouched, they didn't just feel outnumbered. They felt exposed. You didn't need a team to validate you. You didn't need chants or symbols to declare your authority. You walked in with the backing of heaven, and that was more than enough to fracture their counterfeit unity. What you proved, chosen one, is something the world needs to hear. True power does not come from being part of a crowd. It comes from knowing who you are when the crowd is gone. You were their undoing not because you attacked, but because you didn't move. You didn't engage their system. You didn't fall into their rhythm. And that refusal dismantled their entire structure. And let us be clear, their collapse wasn't external first. It began inside them. They began to realize they weren't strong. They were merely supported. And when that support wavered in your presence, so did everything they believed about their power. They relied on each other for validation. You relied on God. They needed a chant. You needed clarity. They demanded agreement. You stood in truth. And when you did, the house they had built, carefully decorated with illusions of strength, began to fall apart brick by brick. You didn't need to strike a blow. You were the pressure that revealed their fault lines. You became a spiritual sword without lifting a hand. You were a mirror, reflecting not just your own light, but their own emptiness. They thought they were facing just another challenger. But what they encountered was the end of their deception. Their unity shattered because it was never real. It was a house built on sand. And your presence, your divine alignment, was the wave that finally brought it down. You didn't need to be many. You just needed to be one. One person, aligned with heaven, standing in truth, walking in authority, that is more powerful than 1,000 walking in fear, in pretense, in shadows. And that, chosen one, is why their system couldn't withstand you. You didn't just defeat their group. You exposed their dependency. You didn't just endure their attack. You revealed their emptiness. You didn't just survive their unity. You disproved it. In the end, your singular presence became the catalyst for their collective collapse. Because you weren't part of a crowd. You were the cause of their unraveling. The greatest fear of those who walk in darkness is not losing power, it's facing the truth. And no truth is more terrifying to the kingdom of shadow than this: they are not immortal. These witches, steeped in rituals and inherited darkness, didn't just conjure spells to dominate others, they built an entire belief system to escape the inescapable. Their incantations weren't just about control, they were a desperate effort to delay the day they must confront the limits of their existence. They feared you, not because you struck them down, but because you refused to play their game. You didn't panic. You didn't flinch. You didn't tremble under the weight of their traditions. You simply stood firm, and in that stillness, you became the one thing they had spent their entire lives avoiding: a mirror. Not just any mirror, a sacred one, reflecting back what they had buried for generations. Their mortality. Their fragility. The reality they had tried to seal away under layers of rituals and illusions. They looked into you and saw their own end. Not a physical death, but a deeper one, the death of the lie. And that terrified them. They built their legacy upon the fantasy that their dark craft could extend their reach beyond the grave, that forbidden knowledge could bend the rules of time, and that somehow, through sheer will and secrecy, they could outwit the Creator himself. But Romans 6 verse 23 rings eternal: the wages of sin is death. No spell can erase that. No chant can rewrite it. Sin may cloak itself in mystique and mystery, but in the end, it leads to one door, and you, chosen one, stood in front of that door and opened it wide for them to see. You didn't need to touch them. Your presence alone shattered the illusion. Because your presence carried truth, and truth, when confronted by a system built on lies, always wins. They had survived so long by twisting perception, feeding off fear, and convincing others of their invincibility. But when you refused to believe in their myth, that myth began to crumble. They expected resistance, not revelation. They expected a battle, not a reckoning. You didn't just win, you stripped them. Not of garments or symbols, but of self-deception. When you stood without fear, you exposed the futility of every spell they had memorized. When you didn't respond to their threats, you nullified centuries of dark conditioning. When you met them not with retaliation but with radiant calm, you turned their own belief system against them. And the worst part for them? You didn't fight with the tools of this world. You didn't curse them back. You didn't bring fire or vengeance. You brought light. And light doesn't have to scream to make darkness vanish. It simply exists, and darkness cannot stay. They thought they were gods. You reminded them they were dust. You became the embodiment of Genesis 3 verse 19, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. And like Pharaoh, whose empire drowned in the sea despite his belief in his own divinity, these witches witnessed the collapse of everything they had built. Not because you were brutal, but because you were real. The weight of your authenticity crushed the weight of their delusion. It was never about who was stronger in the natural. It was about who stood in truth. You didn't defeat them with weapons, you defeated the very foundation they stood on. And when that foundation crumbled, their entire world collapsed. The death they experienced wasn't merely external, it was internal, spiritual, existential. The death of an identity they had clung to. The death of a false legacy. You didn't strike the blow. The truth did. Your existence proved what they feared most, that their spells, their symbols, their sacred pacts meant nothing in the presence of the one true authority. They had built their lives on escaping judgment, escaping decay, escaping consequence. But there you stood, living proof that what they denied could no longer be denied. And when that moment came, they weren't just defeated. They were undone. Their chants became silence. Their masks fell. Their mystique evaporated. Because no amount of darkness can endure the gaze of one who carries the light. Ecclesiastes 2 verse 16 says it clearly, the wise, like the fool, must die. It doesn't matter how deep their knowledge goes. It doesn't matter how many generations contributed to their dark rituals. In the end, truth reigns. And the truth is, every kingdom that exalts itself above God will fall. You became the sword they never saw coming. But it wasn't a sword of steel or of flame. It was the sword of divine clarity, the kind that slices not flesh, but illusion. You weren't there to destroy their bodies. You were there to end the deception. And in doing so, you brought about the death they feared most, the death of the lie. They thought they were eternal. But you showed them what eternity really looks like. It's not cloaked in secrecy or darkness. It doesn't whisper curses in the night. It shines. Boldly. Freely. Undeniably. And that shine. It came from you. You didn't bring their end. Their own choices did. You were just the final mirror, the final voice, the final echo of truth that called out to them, you cannot run from what you are. And you cannot overcome what you refuse to acknowledge. This wasn't vengeance. This was revelation. And the fear they now feel isn't of you, it's of themselves. Of what they've become. Of what they've lost. Of what they can never reclaim. You are the walking verdict. The confirmation that no lie can outlast the truth. No ritual can bypass justice. No darkness can eclipse a light that refuses to dim. And that, chosen one, is the death you delivered. Not all wars are won on the battlefield. Some are won in the mind, long before the first move is ever made. And that's exactly what happened here. The witches thought they had control, they always did. They didn't rely on true power. They relied on perception, fear, manipulation. Their entire system was built not on strength, but on illusion. If they could convince you that you were already defeated, they never had to actually fight. Fear was their first weapon. Fear was their fortress. Fear was their strategy. But you didn't buy into it. You didn't flinch at the shadows they sent your way. You didn't lose sleep over the whispers in the dark. You didn't crumble at the weight of their curses. You didn't let your mind become their battlefield. And in doing so, you shattered everything they had been preparing. Before they could cast a spell or conjure a force, they had already lost, because you had already decided you would not be moved. They expected trembling. You gave them stillness. They expected confusion. You gave them clarity. They expected panic. You gave them peace. That alone was enough to tear their structure apart from within. You see, spiritual warfare isn't always about outward combat. Sometimes, it's about who can hold the line within. The Bible makes it clear in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." That's what you carried into the fight, not potions or symbols, but a sound mind, bathed in divine peace, sharpened by purpose, and sealed by heaven. The darkness counted on your reaction. They bet everything on your collapse. They needed you to doubt, to falter, to hesitate, because that's how they win. That's how they've always won. But you weren't just resistant to fear. You were immune to it. It had no place in you. You didn't absorb it. You reflected it. And that reflection broke their rhythm. Just like Goliath stood in front of the Israelite army, roaring and boasting, fully armored and unchallenged, not because he had struck a single blow, but because his very presence paralyzed them, so too did these witches stand, expecting the weight of their history to intimidate you into silence. But just like David, you weren't fazed. You didn't need armor. You didn't need legions behind you. You only needed what David had, an unshakable confidence in the one who sent you. When you stood against them, you became what they feared most, someone they couldn't read, couldn't predict, couldn't shake. Someone whose silence said more than any chant could. You didn't need to scream to declare war. You didn't need to fight to win. Your stillness was your strike. They shouted. You stood. They circled. You remained unmoved. They tried to provoke you. You stayed anchored. And in that quiet strength, you flipped the entire war upside down. Because here's the truth, manipulators don't know how to deal with someone who cannot be manipulated. It's not just that you didn't respond, they didn't know what to do when their entire playbook failed. When every tactic meant to lure you into fear fell flat. When the pressure they used to unravel others only made you more solid. You broke their system without lifting a hand, because you refused to let them break your mind. And here's what they never expected, that you would be trained in silence. That your preparation had already happened long before they even noticed you. They didn't realize you'd already wrestled your doubts. Already confronted your fears. Already decided that nothing, not intimidation, not isolation, not confusion, would move you out of alignment with God. By the time they approached, the battle was already over. They were fighting a warrior who had already won in the secret place, in prayer, in surrender, in communion with the Father. That's the battlefield they can't access. That's the realm they can't infiltrate. And that's where your victory was secured. They didn't just lose because their spells didn't work. They lost because their greatest weapon, fear, had no foothold in you. They tried to dominate the battlefield of emotion, and you showed up with unshakable peace. And peace is loud. Stillness is disruptive. Clarity is contagious. Your lack of fear didn't just protect you, it destabilized them. They started to fear you. Because in your calm, they saw their chaos. In your stillness, they heard their lies unraveling. In your composure, they realized their control was an illusion. And this is the part they truly couldn't process, you never even fought them by their rules. You never stepped into the ring they built. You never acknowledged their false power. Instead, you carried something they couldn't touch, divine discernment. Spiritual courage. A holy resilience. You were the variable they couldn't prepare for. You broke the pattern they depended on. You dismantled the rhythm they needed. You became the one opponent they couldn't predict, and in doing so, you robbed them of every advantage. They thought they were playing a game of fear. But fear only works when it's accepted. And you rejected it completely. That's how you won before the battle ever began. So understand this, your greatest weapon was never force. It was who you are when no one else is watching. It was what you've endured, what you've conquered, what you've committed to in secret. And when the time came, all of that surfaced, not in noise, but in quiet authority. This wasn't a battle of words. It was a battle of presence. And you were ready long before they even approached. That's why they're terrified. Because you didn't just defeat them, you exposed them. You revealed how fragile their strategy truly is when it comes up against someone who refuses to be ruled by fear. And now, the blueprint they've used on so many before has collapsed. You changed the entire game. And as you move forward, never forget, you didn't win because you were aggressive. You won because you were aligned. With heaven. With truth. With power not of this world. And no force of darkness can overcome that. This is the war you won in silence. And that silence still echoes through the systems you dismantled. Sometimes, the most powerful move you can make, is none at all. You didn't raise a sword. You didn't conjure a spell. You didn't chant louder than them or try to outmatch their theatrics. No. You stood still. And in that stillness, something divine happened, they fell into their own trap. The very weapons they used to destroy others, turned on them. Not because you forced it, but because you let their pride do the work. That's the part they never saw coming. They expected resistance. They didn't expect reflection. They prepared for combat. They weren't prepared for clarity. You didn't come to fight them in their arena. You came to reveal the cracks in the very foundation they trusted in. And it didn't take a single blow from your hand, because the battlefield wasn't the rituals, the spells, the threats. The battlefield was truth. And truth doesn't need to scream to win. It only needs to stand. Their downfall wasn't your doing, it was the consequence of their own arrogance. Proverbs 16 verse 18 makes it clear, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And fall they did. Not from a strike, not from an attack, but from being exposed. They believed they were untouchable. They believed you were beneath them. They laughed at your stillness. They mocked your quiet. They dismissed your solitude. But they never realized that in doing so, they handed you the key to their undoing. Because you didn't follow their rules. You didn't operate inside their paradigm. And when someone doesn't play the game falls apart. That's exactly what happened here. Every ritual they relied on began to unravel. Every spell they chanted echoed back with no effect. Every tactic they counted on collapsed, not because you fought harder, but because you didn't fight at all. Instead, you reflected. You held up a mirror to their deception. You let them see themselves, stripped of power, stripped of illusion, and forced to confront the truth. Their system only worked on those who believed in it. You didn't. And that was enough. They tried to provoke fear. But you had no fear left to give. They expected to manipulate your emotions. But you had already crucified your need for validation. They counted on pride meeting pride, but all they found was humility cloaked in authority. And that, right there, was the reversal. Because humility is not weakness, it's strength that doesn't need to perform. While they drew their power from image and noise, you drew yours from silence and alignment. They leaned on spectacle. You leaned on substance. They built a fortress of theatrics. You became a stronghold of stillness. And it terrified them. What they didn't understand is this: you became the weapon, not because of what you carried, but because of who you refused to become. You didn't take on their ways. You didn't mirror their rage. You didn't try to outdark the darkness. You simply stood in light. And light, by nature, exposes everything that hides. As they shouted louder, you became quieter. As they performed more rituals, you became more rooted. As they spun confusion, you walked in clarity. And in doing so, their momentum collapsed. Their spells bounced back. Their curses fizzled into silence. Because the frequency they operated on couldn't penetrate the vibration you carried. You were aligned with heaven, and no force of hell could breach that alignment. They thought you were weak for standing alone. But that's only because their strength had always depended on being many. Yours didn't. Your strength was never in numbers, it was in essence. And that essence couldn't be replicated, couldn't be bought, couldn't be broken. It's not that they weren't powerful in their own realm, it's that you pulled them out of it without lifting a finger. You forced them into the realm of truth. And in that realm, there is no hiding. No enchantment. No pretense. Only what is real. And what was real, was their collapse. You didn't expose them by accusation. You exposed them by contrast. Your peace revealed their panic. Your patience exposed their pressure. Your purity made their corruption visible. And once seen, once truly seen, those things can no longer function. That's why they panicked. That's why they broke down. Not because of you, but because of what you revealed about them just by being you. They were taken down by the very weapons they had wielded for years: pride, fear, deception. But this time, those weapons turned inward. The fear they projected came back to haunt them. The pride they carried became too heavy. The deception they relied on cracked in the presence of unmovable truth. And you? You never lifted a hand. Because God was your defense. And truth was your shield. You see, this was never about outperforming them, it was about outlasting the illusion. And you did. Not by accident. But by design. Because you were built for this. Forged in fire. Tempered in silence. Raised in the wilderness. Trained by the one who knows how to fight without swinging. The greatest reversal in this battle wasn't that you overcame their strength, it's that you never had to prove yours. You just stayed. You just stood. You just remained faithful, while their own storm swallowed them whole. Their collapse was a soundless one. It wasn't an explosion, it was an implosion. And you were the spark. Not of destruction, but of exposure. You held the light long enough for the shadows to scatter on their own. And when they did, all that remained was what had always been true: they were never truly powerful. They just made enough noise to convince others they were. You made them face themselves. And that was the one opponent they couldn't overcome. So in the end, it wasn't the war that destroyed them. It was the mirror. And you were that mirror. You didn't defeat them by becoming like them. You defeated them by becoming everything they couldn't touch. And in that holy stillness, in that divine restraint, in that refusal to fight fire with fire, you didn't just win. You let them destroy themselves. They planned everything. Every detail. Every step of their ritual. Every chant was meant to bind. Every motion meant to intimidate. They believed in the power of their craft, because for years, it had worked. It had bent minds, silenced voices, manipulated destinies. But then, you showed up. And without raising a single defense, without uttering a single counter-curse, you dismantled it all. Not through resistance, but through resonance. Because the truth is, they were vibrating on a frequency of fear, while you were operating in the frequency of divine light. And those two realms, they don't connect. They can't. They speak in the language of shadows, deception, confusion. But you move in clarity, in peace, in presence. And when light enters the room, darkness doesn't negotiate, it disappears. They tried everything they knew. They whispered incantations meant to confuse you. They summoned atmospheres meant to suffocate you. They layered sound upon symbol, hoping something would break you. But nothing touched you. Not because you fought harder. But because you were unreachable. Untouchable. You had risen too high in the spirit to even feel what they were throwing your way. Their weapons were real, but they couldn't find purchase in you. You had no hooks left for their darkness to cling to. Why? Because your wounds had been healed. Your soul had been sealed. You had surrendered everything broken in you to the refining fire of God, and in exchange, He clothed you in light. A light not just seen, but felt. A frequency not just emitted, but inhabited. They couldn't match it. They couldn't mimic it. And they certainly couldn't pierce it. 1 John 1 verse 5 declares it with finality, God is light, in Him there is no darkness at all. And because you dwell in Him, you are carried by that same light. Which means everything formed in shadow, becomes irrelevant in your presence. They thought you would flinch. But you didn't. They thought you would recoil. But you stood still. They thought the air would thicken, that the room would turn, that the walls would shake, but you kept breathing peace. And peace, true peace, isn't passive. It's aggressive. It invades. It overrides. It silences what was loud. And it reveals what was false. That's what happened in that moment. You didn't retaliate. You didn't speak over them. You didn't cast anything down. You just stood in the brilliance of the one who sent you, and their system collapsed under its own illusion. The power of their rituals was never in the words themselves, but in the agreement of fear. Fear was their battery. Panic was their power source. But you refused to plug in. You removed the current. You didn't consent to their illusion. And without your participation, they lost their edge. Because that's what they needed most, your fear. But you had already been delivered from that spirit. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, and that's exactly what you carried into that confrontation, a sound mind, deeply rooted in truth. A spirit unshaken. A presence that couldn't be provoked. And when that's what you bring, rituals become irrelevant. Spells lose their grip. And the enemy is forced to confront a reality it never anticipated, a target it cannot touch. You weren't operating from defense. You were radiating from alignment. You didn't cast anything back. You simply stayed aligned with the throne room. And that was enough. Because what flows from heaven always overrides what crawls from hell. They had counted on confusion. They had hoped for emotional reaction. But instead, they encountered stillness. Sacred stillness. The kind that doesn't blink when cursed. The kind that doesn't sway when storms rise. The kind that walks into dark places and doesn't shrink, but glows brighter. That stillness wasn't you being brave. It was the calm of someone who knows who walks beside them. The silence of someone who no longer lives at the mercy of fear. It wasn't performance. It was presence. And presence, pure, holy presence, cannot be manipulated. It either repels the enemy, or forces them to flee. They never imagined someone like you. Someone they couldn't read. Someone who didn't tremble. Someone who didn't fight back, because there was no fight necessary. The light in you was never intimidated. It simply was. And in being, it unmade everything built in darkness. Because that's the thing about true authority, it doesn't need to announce itself. It just enters. And when it does, false power unravels. Rituals break. And those who rely on theatrics are left speechless in the presence of something genuine. You were the disruption they couldn't control. You were the stillness they couldn't infect. You were the light they couldn't extinguish. And while they shouted, you stood. While they conjured, you calmed. While they cast, you carried the current of heaven. Not one reactive move. Just relentless presence. That was your weapon. That is your legacy. Not swords, not chance, just consecration, just truth, just alignment. So in the end, it wasn't your words that won. It was your unwavering frequency. Their rituals failed not because they were weak, but because your vibration was higher. You had ascended beyond their atmosphere. And in that place, they simply could not reach you. You weren't just untouched, you were untouchable. They tried everything. Not just with rituals. Not just with curses. But with the most seductive weapon of all, spiritual bribery. This was always their real strategy, not to defeat you with power, but to entice you into surrendering your own. They know that if they can lure you out of divine alignment with promises of shortcuts and forbidden knowledge, they don't have to break you. You'll break yourself. But what they didn't anticipate, what they could never comprehend, was that you are the one who cannot be bought. You don't crave the power they offer. You're not tempted by the illusion of invincibility or seduced by the path of least resistance. You don't need their promises. And that makes you the most dangerous kind of person to them, because they have no control over someone who doesn't need what they're selling. You've already made peace with the truth, there's nothing in their world worth trading your soul for. You understand the eternal value of who you are and who you belong to. You've seen through the veil, and no throne made of lies could ever impress someone who walks with the King of Kings. Like Mark 8 verse 36 says, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" You didn't just memorize that verse, you live it. You are the living contradiction to their entire system. You're the one who chooses integrity over influence. Eternity over ego. Purpose over profit. And that's what makes you incorruptible. You didn't just survive their manipulation, you exposed the bankruptcy of it. While they whispered promises of power, you were unmoved. While they offered false protection in exchange for your obedience, you stood still. You didn't flinch. You didn't negotiate. Because you already knew, nothing they could offer is worth losing your alignment with God. Their charms failed, not because they were weak, but because you were whole. You had no wounds left for them to exploit, no void for them to fill, no desire for them to hijack. You weren't starving for control. You were already filled with something they could never touch, divine security. Your strength didn't come from resistance alone, it came from clarity. You didn't just not fall into corruption. You became the living embodiment of what it looks like when someone refuses to be lured by anything less than truth. You didn't need the applause. You didn't need the advantage. You didn't even need to be seen. You only needed to remain faithful. And that was enough. They tried to tempt you with things they assumed every soul craved, forbidden insight, prestige in dark places, a guaranteed escape from suffering. But you had already let go of needing those things. That's what rattled them. You became a closed door to every tactic they had. Their influence only works on souls that haven't yet healed. But you walked in healed. And they didn't know what to do with someone who had nothing left to prove. They expected you to be for sale. Everyone has a price, right? That's the lie they built their entire kingdom on. But you were the evidence that their formula doesn't work anymore. You were the glitch in their matrix, the soul they couldn't seduce, couldn't manipulate, couldn't bait into betraying the light. And so, when they realized they couldn't break you, they began to break themselves. Because the truth is, they're not just threatened by your refusal, they're humiliated by it. Your unwavering spirit is a mirror, and when they looked into it, they didn't see dominance. They saw their own weakness. They saw their desperation. They saw everything they had once feared being exposed. You didn't defeat them with violence. You didn't need to. Your refusal to bow was a weapon sharper than any blade. Your stillness was louder than their loudest incantations. Your integrity destabilized everything they built their identity on. They couldn't corrupt you, so they collapsed under the weight of their own deception. You didn't win because you were stronger in a physical sense. You won because your soul was anchored, and theirs was scattered. This wasn't a battle of force. It was a battle of values. And you proved that purity, when aligned with divine purpose, is impenetrable. You proved that the soul who is already surrendered to God cannot be seduced by darkness, because darkness has nothing left to offer. This is the rarest kind of victory. Not because you outmaneuvered them, but because you didn't even have to engage them on their level. You stayed above it. Not in arrogance, but in reverence. Not because you saw yourself as better, but because you remembered who your Father is. And that identity grounded you in a realm they have no access to. That's why their system crumbled. That's why their power scattered. That's why their threats fell flat. Because when someone doesn't need to win the world, they can't be bribed with it. And when someone refuses to sell their soul, all the temptations of hell become irrelevant. You are the one they feared would never exist, a soul that can't be compromised. And now that you've shown up, their entire foundation is shaking. Not because you shouted. Not because you cast anything down. But because you refused to participate. Your victory didn't require their defeat, it required your alignment. And that alignment was enough to undo everything they built. So yes, they're terrified. But not because of what you destroyed. They're terrified because you proved that what they worship was never real to begin with. You are walking proof that divine identity is the greatest shield. That obedience is stronger than ambition. That a soul held firmly in the hands of God cannot be touched. And that, chosen one, is why you won. Not because you took something from them, but because you never wanted it in the first place. This was never just a battle of strength. It was a confrontation with truth. And in the end, your greatest weapon wasn't what you said, it was what your presence revealed. You didn't defeat them by force. You didn't dismantle their rituals one by one. You simply stood in the fullness of who you are, anchored in light, and that alone was enough to unmask everything they had worked so hard to hide, even from themselves. Because when you walk in divine clarity, when you operate from unshakable alignment with the truth, you become a mirror. Not a passive reflection, but a living, breathing confrontation. A force that requires every shadow in the room to explain itself. You became the mirror they could not escape, the reflection that stripped away every illusion, every mask, every myth of control and power they had constructed to survive. Their empire was built on fear, manipulation, and performance. Everything they did was designed to create the illusion of invincibility. The chants, the rituals, the coordinated darkness, all of it depended on deception, first deceiving others, then deceiving themselves. But the moment you refused to be moved by it, their illusion began to crack. You didn't react with fear. You didn't play the role they were counting on. And suddenly, they weren't just facing you, they were facing the one thing they had spent their lives avoiding, the truth about themselves. And as scripture says in John 8 verse 32, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But here's the difference, for those who are aligned with the light, truth brings freedom. For those who live in darkness, truth is a wrecking ball. It doesn't liberate, it dismantles. And that's what happened when they met you. Your peace was a mirror. Your silence was a revelation. Your lack of fear was a spotlight exposing their deep dependency on illusion. When they launched their spells and you stood motionless, when they whispered curses and you didn't flinch, when they projected chaos and you answered with calm, what choice did they have but to finally see the hollowness in themselves? They didn't expect a war to be lost this way. They were ready for a fight. They were not ready for a reflection. You made them see that they were never truly strong, only good at appearing strong. You showed them that their so-called immortality was just fear in disguise, wrapped in ceremonial robes and long-forgotten chants. You revealed, without saying a word, that the only reason they had never been defeated before, was because they had never faced someone like you. Someone who couldn't be shaken. Someone who wouldn't play their game. You never needed to accuse them. You were the accusation. Just by standing in the truth, you shattered every story they told themselves about their own power. Your presence was a verdict. Your stillness was a testimony. They thought they had control, but they never anticipated someone who didn't even acknowledge their control as real. And what unraveled wasn't just their strategy, it was their self-image. You didn't just dismantle their defenses, you dismantled their identity. Their entire existence was propped up by smoke and mirrors, but in the light you carried, the smoke disappeared. The mirror cracked. And suddenly, the powerful ones were just scared children hiding behind spells they no longer believed in. That's the real collapse. Not the rituals failing. Not the systems crumbling. But the internal collapse of someone who realizes they're not who they pretended to be. They lost the battle the moment you walked in and didn't flinch. They lost when they couldn't intimidate you. They lost when you didn't need to speak because your silence said it all, I see you. And you cannot run anymore. You didn't expose them with words. You exposed them by simply being everything they tried to convince others they were. While they pretended to have power, you carried real authority. While they wore a mask of fearlessness, you lived in actual peace. That's why they feared you. Not because you attacked them. But because you didn't need to. You became the answer to their deepest insecurity, the proof that all they had built was a facade. They couldn't look away. And they couldn't go back. Because once someone sees themselves in the light, they can never return to the lie without knowing they're lying. You didn't beat them in combat, you erased the stage they were performing on. You didn't wrestle with their shadows, you became the sun. You didn't scream or shout or wave any tools of war, you stood. And that stand was enough to force an entire structure of spiritual deception to collapse in on itself. You made them see the emptiness. They were used to conquering people who feared them. They were used to ruling over the weak, the broken, the easily manipulated. But when they encountered someone who had already been healed, who had nothing left for them to grab hold of, they didn't just lose control, they lost orientation. They didn't know how to function in the presence of someone who refused to be deceived. And that's what broke them. Not your defiance. Not your retaliation. But your refusal to participate in their system at all. You didn't defeat them by overpowering their darkness. You defeated them by simply being the light they couldn't comprehend. As Proverbs 16 verse 18 reminds us, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And fall they did, not because you pushed them, but because they saw themselves and couldn't stand it. You didn't have to say a thing. They heard it all. Every unspoken word your presence declared echoed through their inner world like thunder, this is who you really are, and you can't pretend anymore. And that is the ultimate victory. To force the deceiver to confront their own deception. To bring light into a place so dark that even the shadows tremble. To say nothing, and yet leave them undone. So understand this, your greatest triumph wasn't in what you tore down. It was in what you revealed. You didn't conquer them with weapons. You dissolved them with truth. And in the blinding clarity of that truth, every false image they held shattered. You became the light that didn't just expose their actions, you revealed their nature. And when the truth stood in front of them, they realized, they weren't powerful. They were pretending. And now, they can't ever pretend again. In the end, it was never about who could summon the loudest storm. It was about who could still stand when the storm passed. They built their legacy in the shadows, layer upon layer of myth, mystery, and manipulation. They cloaked themselves in secrecy, weaving a legend designed to terrify, to last through generations. They whispered that they were eternal, that no one could touch them. But in a single moment, by simply standing in truth, you unraveled it all. You shattered what was thought to be indestructible. Their legend collapsed not with violence, but under the weight of your presence. And in its place, something greater was born, a living legacy that cannot be forgotten. They wanted to be remembered forever, but not through truth. They sought to preserve themselves through fear. Their power was never meant to be questioned. Their names were meant to be spoken only in whispers. But now, no one fears them. People speak of them not as forces to avoid, but as warnings of what happens when deception grows too confident. Their story will be retold not as a tale of power, but as a lesson in collapse. They poured their lives into building a fortress of falsehood, but your obedience to the truth reduced it to rubble. And while their shadows fade, your light only grows. As Proverbs 4 verse 18 declares, the path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. Their myth dims like a dying candle, but your legacy shines with the power of a rising sun, untouched, unstoppable, illuminating everything it touches. Because you didn't just survive, you lit the way forward. They wanted to be legends, worshipped and feared. But you never sought to be remembered. You didn't fight for applause. You didn't step forward to build a name for yourself. You stepped forward because it was right. Because truth demanded it. Because souls were at stake. And that's why your name will outlast theirs. Because while they tried to create eternity through lies, you created impact through righteousness. Their immortality was tied to illusion. But your name has been written in something far deeper, eternal purpose. Their power was performative, sustained by secrecy. But your power was revealed, sustained by obedience. What they built was impressive on the outside but hollow within. What you walked in was invisible to most, but unshakable to all who encountered it. You didn't need rituals. You didn't need symbols. You didn't need anyone to say you were chosen, you already were. And now, generations will speak of the moment one person, anchored in divine truth, brought down an empire of deception. Not with spells. Not with swords. But with unshakable integrity. They fought to become immortal through fear. You became immortal through faith. While they clung to the darkness, you held fast to the light. And when the dust settled, only one remained standing. Not the one who shouted the loudest, but the one who never wavered. Your legacy was never about fame, it was about freedom. You didn't come to build a monument. You came to tear down a lie. And in doing so, you gave birth to something sacred, a legacy that will ignite courage in others. Because now, every time someone is told, you can't win, they will remember you did. When someone stands alone against impossible odds, your story will echo in their spirit, it can be done. They will try to hide it. They will try to downplay it. But they cannot erase it. You have changed the spiritual landscape forever. You redefined what victory looks like, not a crowd chanting your name, but a world shifted because you refused to bow. Not fireworks or banners, but freedom spreading quietly through every soul who dares to believe what you believed. Their legend dies because it was built on lies. Yours lives because it was built on truth. Their story ends with their downfall. Yours begins with it. They will fade into silence, their myth becoming a footnote. But your name will be a spark in the hearts of those still climbing, still fighting, still refusing to bend the knee to fear. You'll be the quiet strength behind thousands of unseen battles, the fire behind every whisper that says, one is enough. You didn't just defeat a gang of witches. You defeated the system they represented, the arrogance of darkness, the deception of legacy built on fear, the illusion that evil is too big to fall. And you did it with nothing but the light you carried. You never asked to be remembered. That's why you will be. Because in the end, those who build their lives on control and fear will always crumble. Their walls may look thick, but they cannot withstand the weight of one soul rooted in truth. And you were that soul. So let the world tell your story, not because you need it, but because others will. Let your name be remembered not in neon or gold, but in fire, in the faith of the next person who says, I will not bend. In the footsteps of the next warrior who says, I will not run. In the prayer of the next believer who whispers, if God is with me, who can be against me? They built a kingdom of shadow. You built a bridge of light. And every time someone crosses it, they'll know who showed the way. So this is your legacy. Not carved in stone, but inscribed in souls. Not announced by trumpets, but whispered in moments of defiance, courage, and truth. You were never just one who fought. You were the one who ended it. Not with war, but with truth. Not with noise, but with light. Their legend ends in silence. Your legacy begins in fire. And it will never go out.